That was the biggest takeaway to me from all this, was just the naked contempt they have for the American people. You do not have a shitting grin like he had if you have the slightest shred of respect for the people that you're supposed to represent.
For the past year and a half, there's been so much discussion over why we need to ban TikTok. You've heard time and time again that China is a massive threat to national security. We need to ban this to protect the American public. But this week, one congressman, Mark Warner, actually revealed the real reason why TikTok was banned at a national security forum. Ken Klippenstein is an amazing independent journalist. He's been covering this story, and I wanted to have him join me today so that we could really break down why TikTok was banned, unpack the motivations, go through the timeline of the ban, and kind of dispel a bunch of myths, I think, surrounding this whole ban, because there's been so much misinformation rampant online. And here, I think we have finally seen confirmation of what Ken and I both and many other journalists have reported on for months, that it's actually not China that spooked a bunch of congressmen. So Ken, thanks for joining me.
Hey, good to be with you again, Taylor.
So Mark Warner was on this panel that was some sort of international security conference, and he was talking to Rep. Gallagher, who really led the charge to ban TikTok. Why did he say TikTok was banned?
What caught my eye when I watched this video, which was a recording of a discussion, a panel, a moderated discussion at the Munich Security Conference in Munich, Warner says, "Are you going to tell the real story of what happened with TikTok?"
Mike, how did that legislation pass so quickly? If this is correct and there's not a lot of people that understand, somebody understood something.
I want to see if you're going to tell the real story.
Okay, well, first of all, let the record
we're talking
reflect.
about the TikTok legislation.
So it was the threat of espionage, the threat of propaganda, the good work of Senator Warner, and a few other players that all conspired. I mean, that was a 3-year endeavor and it failed, 100 times.
And that caught my attention. I thought, wait, you're admitting that there is a story that we don't know. And the question is, why didn't you tell us first? And second of all, what is the real story? So in remarkably candid terms, Representative Gallagher, he's no longer a congressman. He's now actually an executive at Palantir, which is funny in itself, goes on to explain how this legislation was passed. All began with President Trump, who issued his first, ironically, executive order banning the use of the device in certain circumstances. Biden ended up reversing it. And then legislation later on during the Biden administration is proposed to put the ban in place again. And that's sort of winding its way through Congress. They're not having very much success. And Gallagher recounts how many times they had to try to bring this up again and again and again. And just wouldn't even get out of committee. That's like the first hurdle that you have to clear before it goes to a floor vote where everybody votes on it. And that ultimately is what passes something into law. They couldn't even get it past the committee of like 20 people or so. And so he says there was a moment where the dam broke, and he identifies that moment as October 7th, 2023, when Hamas attacked Israel. He said at that moment, boom, suddenly there was all of this interest in the platform because we could say that, oh, there's all of this anti-Israel content on it. He characterizes that as anti-Semitic. I think we have to be careful because he wasn't specific about what in particular he's talking about on the platform. Different people define that differently. And
well, let's just be clear. Being anti-Israel is not anti-Semitic. And I think that we should just make that clear.
Exactly. I know from talking to my own sources at the State Department that around that exact same time, they were having private meetings, and I published a memo detailing one of these meetings between the State Department and the Israeli Foreign Ministry, in which senior Israeli officials are freaking out about all of the criticism of Israel on the platform, and they are convinced that it has to do with the algorithm that TikTok has. Now, my sources and the memo show that he doesn't cite any specific evidence to say that. And what's interesting about it is that privately, the State Department was telling him, hey, I think this is actually just sincere. You can agree or disagree with the young people that are demonstrating, but these are sincerely held beliefs. We're worried that you're overlooking that fact and trying to just scapegoat this. I found that interesting because the State Department doesn't say that publicly. But in any case, I encourage people to go on the story, read the memo for themselves, see that privately, that at least the State Department part of the Biden administration knew that a lot of this stuff is, authentic. I'm sure they wouldn't agree with it, but they didn't think that it was all this algorithm. But in any case, he's pushing this at the same time that Congress is pushing this as well. And then lo and behold, it ends up getting out of committee after a classified briefing a few months subsequent to the October 7th attack, in which every single member of that committee ends up voting unanimously to pass this legislation that would later become the ban. We can talk about in a moment how they try to characterize this as, oh, we're just forcing a divestiture. It's not actually a ban. Well, we saw how that ended up just sort of collapsing and becoming the ban that they said it was never going to be. But in any case, so they give them this classified briefing, details of which obviously we don't publicly know, but you can get a sense based on how members of Congress who are given this briefing characterize it in general terms. Maybe they can't talk about the classified specifics, but they can give you a general idea. I want to read for you a quote from California Congresswoman Sarah Jacobs talking about what she saw in the briefing. She wasn't in the committee that voted on it. I assume she voted against the legislation, but here's what she said about it. She says, quote, "Not a single thing we heard in today's classified briefing was unique to TikTok. It was things that happen on every single social media platform." And so this is what we've talked about before. All of the data collection that happens, the media reports it in a way that they're kind of withholding the crucial context of that you can buy all the same data on the private market via data brokers, via other social media platforms. And so there's this kind of studied ignorance to pretend like this is only happening to TikTok, which isn't to say that that's not concerning and that doesn't, merit our thinking about it and saying, okay, well, what can we do to change this? But to pretend like it's just one platform, it's not true. It's misleading. And unfortunately, that's the picture that the media has painted about this.
Well, I want to hop in on the media because at this time, especially in the months following October 7th, we also saw a massive propaganda campaign by the media to push the public to support Israel's actions in Gaza. And you saw places like the New York Times and others running these incredibly irresponsible articles claiming that, anti-Semitism was on the rise because of TikTok, once again conflating anti-Semitism with critiques of Israel, committing genocide. But my colleague Drew Harwell at the Washington Post actually did an excellent story debunking the idea that there was even more pro-Palestinian content on TikTok. In fact, there was more pro-Palestinian content on Instagram, but nobody, of course, was seeking to ban Instagram, right? Like they have sought to crack down on that, I guess. But I just think the media also played a role in this and ran a bunch of articles that were sort of, I don't know how else to describe it other than propaganda. And then they were supported by these think tanks. Paul Matzko, who's a phenomenal researcher, actually posted a really great breakdown of this, and I'll put it in the show notes below the description of the video. He published an article called "The Pro-Israel Techies Who Got TikTok Banned," and he really outlines just step by step who these groups are and how this all came to be. And this was actually months ago, before even this recent stuff came out. In October, tech investor Jeff Morris Jr. wrote a super viral thread that went viral in political circles and Silicon Valley circles titled, quote, "The TikTok War, Why High School and College Kids Are Getting the Wrong Information About Hamas and Israel." Here he claims that he spent weeks trying to reverse the TikTok algorithm. And, in his investigations, he's convinced that this is why we're losing the information war with high school and college students. Absolute nonsense. Not to mention that this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. I think Drew expertly debunked it. But he says, actually, we need to find a way to balance out the narrative. Otherwise, we will fall too far behind. With high school and college kids, this is where they get their news. And basically, you just see them start to talk about how they can exert control over our information ecosystem.
Yeah, just to give you the direct quote from former Congressman Gallagher, who, again, the main guy in the House that was the reason that this stuff happened. He says, quote, "So we had a bipartisan consensus. We had the executive branch, but the bill was still dead until October 7th. He's very clear, not like it was almost there. It was like they had no chance of passing committee. He goes on to say, quote, "And people started to see a bunch of anti-Semitic content on the platform, and our bill had legs again." I couldn't believe how open he was about this thing that people had kind of pieced together. You'd seen Senator Mitt Romney make a much softer comment, but he wasn't involved. He wasn't like the point man on getting this passed in the same way that these two individuals were.
Some wonder why there was such overwhelming support for us to shut down potentially TikTok or other entities of that nature. If you look at the postings on TikTok and the number of mentions of Palestinians relative to other social media sites, it's overwhelmingly so among TikTok broadcast. So I'd note that's of real interest, and the president will get the chance to make action in that regard.
And what was particularly striking about it was how smug they are in recounting this. I encourage people to watch the video, which is posted in my article about it of Senator Warner talking about it. He is grinning when he says, I want to see if you're going to tell the real story. And the person next to him goes, oh boy, here we go. It's an open secret. These guys all know.
Well, I mean, if you just look back at their comments too, I mean, there was on November 10th, right, just a month basically after October 7th, you had Senator Josh Hawley saying that, and this is on the floor of Congress, he says, TikTok has the power to radically distort the picture of the world that America's young people encounter. Israel's unfolding war with Hamas is a crucial test case. Then Marco Rubio follows up and says, TikTok has become a cesspool of pro-Hamas misinformation and indoctrination. He claimed that TikTok was brainwashing American youth. Of course, when they're pressed for examples, they're talking about videos of Palestinian journalists documenting their own deaths. They're talking about on-the-ground reporting from Palestinians who are turning to the internet and just saying, hey, look at what's happening to me. Here's my innocent family members, my daughters, my sons being slaughtered. That's the pro-Hamas propaganda that they're talking about. But you just see them, even like you said, it's like this open secret. But that was what was being discussed, right?
Yeah, the reason it passed was because of the October 7th and then the media environment, the kind of panic that emerged after that. They're very explicit. That's why it passed committee and ultimately was able to pass into law. They said that before that. It's really interesting to see Gallagher describe how we had to try again and again and again, and nothing was sticking, nothing was working. And then finally, here we go. This thing happens. And then it wasn't just that. It was then you get that classified briefing where you can really scare the hell out of all these members who I think this intersects with national security in a really important way, which is that I think people hear, ooh, the intelligence community told them something. They must have all of these secrets that we don't know about. But again, you can piece together the general sense of what it was that was said to them based on how the members, they're allowed to still characterize in general terms without getting into the specifics what they saw. Let me read you some public statements by the various intelligence community principals and leaders talking about this to show you how hypothetical the threat is, because I think there's a sense that they've got the goods somewhere that China did this, and it's just not true. So here's CIA director during the Biden administration in 2022 saying, quote, "It's troubling to see what the Chinese government could do to manipulate TikTok." And this is characteristic. They all phrase this in the conditional, which suggests that they don't actually have it. They're saying this could happen. And when you drill down into the specifics of what their concerns are, it's about a national security directive in China that does allow the Chinese Communist Party, in principle, to coerce companies into doing what they want. That's true. That doesn't mean that they've done that, and we don't have evidence that they have.
And just to be clear, also, this is America. We're supposed to have free speech and open access to information. It is a constitutionally protected right to receive propaganda. We are allowed to read propaganda. That's part of having a free and access open to information. Even if TikTok was 100% Chinese propaganda app, we as Americans have the right to consume that information. Again, this goes back to free and open access to information and free speech. And I just think it's so telling because, of course, they don't have any receipts on anything that they're alleging. Let me just read you.
I want to just read you some of the quotes because it's all like that. I'm not cherry picking. There's nothing else. So the FBI director, Christopher Wray, under the Biden administration, he says, TikTok, quote, "TikTok's parent company is controlled by the Chinese government and it gives them the potential to leverage the app in ways that I think should concern us." Again, potential. Another statement. Again, I'm not cherry picking. This is just.
But I also just don't want to feed into this idea that they have any evidence of these alleged potentials. You could say aliens are going to land on Earth tomorrow, and that's why we need to take away everyone's cell phone. Sure, that's a potential. That's not something that you have absolutely any evidence of, and nor do you have any evidence of it even potentially happening. And I think actually, like in one of those national security briefings, I know Jim Himes, one lawmaker, was in there among several others who came out after and actually gave statements and said, hey, we were in these meetings and there's absolutely nothing, that's concerning.
Yeah, he said essentially the same thing. And it's unusual for people to buck this, because I think Congress people they see it as kind of like, well, I better just go along with this because I don't want to be called like I'm soft on China or something. So they have a lot of incentive to not make an issue out of this because they don't want to get slimed with this idea that, oh, you are playing into foreign influence operations or whatever. So to have multiple members come out and say that is really noteworthy and significant, I think.
I also think it's just so wild to me that Gallagher was pushing this bill while negotiating a job with Palantir. Palantir, who's worked overtime, has a very tight relationship with Israel. Palantir, the entire board of the company flew to Israel last January to push tech executives to more publicly support Israel. They said that their goal was to, quote, embarrass people who are pro-Israel in private but won't be pro-Israel in public. And, shortly after Gallagher reintroduces the bill to ban TikTok on a Palantir earnings call, one of the executives says that he's exceedingly proud that after October 7th, within weeks, we were on the ground and involved in crucial operations in Israel. So, and they're providing some of the AI tools, by the way, that target people. They're a defense company that does a lot of evil stuff and has contracts with the Israeli military.
Yeah, AI is becoming a cash cow for things like targeting, because the amount of data that they can process with this is not like ChatGPT. These are like algorithms that can make decisions in real time that it would take human intelligence analysts, far longer to do. So for that reason, when you have something which is overwhelmingly an air war, like the war in Gaza, I mean, a lot of this is started out with air power, airstrikes. Software like that can become very useful for generating target sets quickly, that they would be limited in terms of human targeters being able to do. I want to read for you the memo that was given to me, that was sent from the State Department to their Near East diplomats, describing a meeting that they had with the Israeli Foreign Ministry. So this deputy director of the Israeli Foreign Ministry, his name is Nashon, and his American counterpart, his name is Rousseau. It said, the memo reads, Nashon disagreed with Rousseau's assertion that the United States and Israel faced a major credibility problem as a result of the unpopular war in Gaza. Bear in mind, this is the State Department internally acknowledging this and talking about this. So the memo goes on to say, the State Department goes on to say, the Israelis seemed oblivious to the fact that they are facing a major, possibly generational damage to their reputation, not just in the region, but elsewhere in the world. They made the following three main counterpoints to this argument. They say, Israel's main challenge is power projection. And here's the crucial part. Young people have turned against Israel in large part because the TikTok algorithm favors pro-Palestinian content.
It doesn't, and it never did.
Right. But they're convinced of this and going around and lobbying the different groups saying, hey, we've got to do something about this.
Right. And they're convinced of it because they don't want to engage with reality, because they can't comprehend that young people, have a moral compass and are seeing what's going on and just are against it. Like time and time again, and again, reporting from the Wall Street Journal and New York Times and the Post has backed this up, right? Support for Israel has actually been declining for decades. The Israelis have tortured and just destroyed the lives of Palestinians in unfathomable ways. And more young people are waking up to that because of the internet, because of bloggers, because of content creators, because of Instagram, because of TikTok. And I think this is the first major event that you're seeing the entire United States military and government security apparatus try to crack down and realize that they need to censor speech on the internet if they ever want to control the narrative again, because otherwise, the internet and TikTok and these platforms, they allow for a level of free speech that I think people in power don't want the American public to have.
What's interesting too, you mentioned before, they don't want to face the reality. I think that there is this paternalistic attitude that, young people can't hold their own beliefs. They must have just been repeating something they heard. And that emerges in the Munich conference that we were just talking about. Gallagher says another moment of wind at their backs that ended up helping them pass the legislation was when TikTok pushed out that warning to users. So TikTok just did a push notification to users saying, contact Congress if this is something you care about, because there's a risk of the platform being shut down. And what Gallagher says was that they were getting calls from young people that were threatening suicide. And his conclusion to this, it's incredible. Again, I encourage people to watch the video because I'm not exaggerating this.
Kids were calling into their members of Congress during school hours threatening to commit suicide if TikTok went away. And for those of us who are concerned about the use of this platform for propaganda purposes or brainwashing, it sort of proved the point in the moment, and suddenly the bill passed.
His reaction to that was, well, there's proof positive that this is some kind of it's infiltrating the minds of our young people and causing
infiltrating
them to do
the minds of young people to reach out to their congressional representatives. Theoretically, something we should be doing in a democracy. I think it's just so telling how, these congressmen are so angry that they actually had to hear from their representative, from the public on something.
It reminded me of here in Wisconsin, where I live, somebody who I think was 19 years old set fire to a congressman's office who voted for the ban. And what all this says to me is that this is a significant part of people's lives. And when you threaten to take that away, the response should tell you, wow, this is more serious than I thought. And this isn't just, kids playing a video game. Like, this is clearly a part of someone's social structure or whatever. But instead they look at that, they say, oh, look at these crazy kids that have been almost like some Jason Bourne movie. Like there's some code word that China said. Now they've snapped. They're just, they're suicidal or they're attacking things, rather than taking it at face value and saying, oh, wow, this must be something that's harmful to people if they're responding in this way.
And again, China was encouraging young people to use the democratic process. China didn't say, China, first of all, TikTok is not even based in China.
Well, that's the other thing.
Nobody
Yeah.
in China had anything to do with this,
the
at
whole
all.
supposition is the idea that TikTok's parent company, which is based in, there's a lot of reporting where they're like, oh, it's the Chinese. Okay, it's a parent company that happens to be located in China.
Right.
And the assumption is, well, maybe they're being coerced. Maybe they are, but we don't know that. Yeah, no evidence.
We have zero evidence of China ever coercing TikTok's parent company. TikTok is not even based in China, doesn't operate in China. US user data is not even stored in China. There's absolutely zero evidence of China exerting literally even a lick of control over TikTok. There's far more evidence of China exerting control over a platform like Facebook or other tech companies that have very deep ties to China. It's just absurd, but it's also just extra absurd because, again, this company is encouraging young people to engage in the democratic process, to engage in democracy, to contact their representatives. And yeah, this is the response. It just shows how much respect they have for the public.
Yeah, the contempt is just out in the open, because just how long ago was it? 2 or 3 weeks ago that it ended up getting to the point of its being banned, which the Democrats had promised wasn't going to happen, because all this is a forced sale and someone's going to buy it and everything will be fine. And it never happened.
I just want to say too, I did a TikTok video that I collected all of the commentary from everyone, all the leaders of the bill, how they talked about it after it passed. Every single one of them referred to it as a ban. Not one of them referred to it as a forced sale. Not one. This idea that it's a quote unquote forced sale is an entire media creation. The only reason it's not banned currently is because Trump is trying to quote unquote pursue a sale. What will probably happen is that the app will shut down or effectively be dead, and sort of the front end of the app might function or be run by somebody else. But the whole thing is just a farce. They knew it was a ban and they wanted to ban it again to censor speech. And
it's extremely unpopular. What I was struck by was when you look at the polls when it was first passed and there were no concrete effects on people's lives, it was about 50-50, roughly along age lines. Younger people, obviously the ones that use it, opposing the ban. Older people, presumably less likely to use it, supporting the ban. But when it came down to it and people were actually staring down the barrel of this thing happening, around the week of, polling came out overwhelming, just an avalanche of opposition, something like 70% of Americans opposed to it. And predictably, at that point, the people that voted for it, suddenly they're like, oh, what? I had nothing to do with that. Well, I didn't support a ban. And the top Democrat, Senator Chuck Schumer, comes out and is pleading with Biden, saying, this could hurt your legacy if you do this. We have to do something with this. It's like, dude, you voted for that. You passed it. What?
Biden, quite literally, his administration helped Gallagher draft the bill. Biden supported this from the beginning, again, because Biden wanted to crack down on speech related to Israel.
This is what's so shocking to me about it, is it's so unpopular that they are turned tail and suddenly just do a 180, and all the people that voted for it are like, whoa, what? I don't support it. Let's end this thing. I don't want to do this. Nobody wants to be seen with it because it's politically radioactive. And then these two guys at the Munich Security Conference just grinning, practically slapping each other on the back at how amazing it was that they were able to, quote, this is a word they use, conspired to pass this thing.
Conspire, because that's exactly what they did. And look at Gallagher now. He's an executive at Palantir. It's like he scratched Palantir's back. He pushed this, bill through that Palantir and other, competitors wanted to go through. And now he's rewarded with this, massively, well-paid, lucrative executive job at this tech company.
What's beyond belief is literally, as I was running this, I'm looking up Warner to take a look at the comments he's made about it. I see he does an interview, I think with Politico, where he says, the Democrats are out of step on cultural issues. And of course, he's talking about like we need to be more flexible on, trans, opposing trans in sports, stuff like that. It's like, well, how about the social media app that you just voted for and are bragging about literally the day that I'm writing this, bragging about the wildly unpopular policy that you were able to conspire to get through the Congress? What about that?
Well, exactly. And they'll never, ever, ever take any accountability for the harm that they've caused, because there's two main things that I think are going to be horrible ripple effects of this ban. Number one, it just came out this week, data showing that more sales happened in some sort of recent time period through TikTok Shop than Temu and Shein, which is, I think, pretty shocking because
we're talking billions of dollars, right?
Again, yes, TikTok contributes billions of dollars to the US GDP. Hundreds of thousands of Americans rely on TikTok for jobs. It is the backbone of small business marketing in America. TikTok is as much, if not more, an e-commerce platform as it is a social platform. That's why you see people, when they use the sort of coded language around, activism or whatever, they use product language. They talk about products as a way to talk about activism, because it is such a product and sales focused app, which again, these adults don't, like these grown up people, obviously we're adults, but like these boomers, don't seem to realize, like they think it's like some children's dance app. It's a huge e-commerce engine, and it is supporting American businesses, which they are bankrupting. I talk to people all across the country, mostly outside of major metro areas, in the quote unquote real America, right? The middle of the country, people with no access to scale their businesses except through the reach that TikTok grants them. So it's going to be devastating. And then here, this bill has also created this gaping new hole where suddenly the US government is able to exert control over Apple and Google and the App Store. Again, we are not China, right? Our government is not supposed to control the App Store. And it's deeply concerning that now they have, the way the bill is written, this authority to basically ban any social media, information, communication tool, media app that they consider sort of majority foreign owned, or it has a certain level of ownership that, maybe is a foreign adversary. I mean, this law could potentially be used to ban the Al Jazeera app or other international news apps. And this is the type of stuff that we always criticize China for. So it's terrifying that we're seeing this precedent set to erode the speech of hundreds of millions of Americans over a completely theoretical threat. And ultimately, really just because people were speaking out against this genocide that we're funding, that we're giving billions of dollars for.
You mentioned Congressman Jim Himes' opposition to the legislation. I want to quote it now because I feel like that's a good note to end on. In addition to that, I didn't realize this. He was the ranking member of the Intelligence Committee at that time. So they have privileged access to exactly the kinds of information that...
Right. He has more access than anyone else to this stuff. And what did he say?
So he says, quote, "As ranking member of the Intelligence Committee, I have more insight than most into the online threats posed by our adversaries. But one of the key differences between us and those adversaries is the fact that they shut down newspapers, broadcast stations, and social media platforms. We do not. We trust our citizens to be worthy of their democracy. We do not trust our government to decide what information they may or may not see."
Not anymore. not with, Mike Gallagher and Mark Warner in charge, who, by the way, Mark Warner is also a huge booster of the Kids Online Safety Act and all of these other super dangerous censorship bills that will restrict, reproductive justice content, will restrict LGBTQ content. Like the one thing that, again, the Democrats and Republicans constantly work in lockstep to do is censor speech, and it's disgusting.
Yeah, and you look at someone like Warner, it's the same revolving door case that you see that you were describing earlier with Gallagher. He's a senator from Virginia, so he represents all of these defense and national security contractors that have an interest in, you've reported on this, the fact that Facebook was lobbying to try to convince people that their competitor, TikTok, posed some kind of national security threat. So instance after instance, you have the fox guarding the hen house, and media just won't talk about any of it. They behave as though, oh, here's what this, august official said. And we're not really going to mention any of the context around why he might have said that or who he represents. Or, it's just so frustrating.
Well, also, where is the media's coverage of any of this? Again, like some reporters like Drew at the Washington Post have done great jobs sort of dismantling these narratives. But, here's this huge revelation, right? These two senators gloating about how they conspired to take down the biggest social media app in America, or at least the most relevant, because there was too much criticism of U.S. foreign policy on it. That should be front page New York Times news. They will never cover it.
I found it. Nobody had said anything. I'm pretty sure I was the first to even post it. And it's like, well, here's something of huge import, but none of the expert class, none of the national security sort of industry that's watching that, they're not watching it for stuff that's of interest to the general public. They're watching it for, contractors or industry groups, whatever it may be. I mean, this whole thing is just a case study in how broken the media is.
Yeah, well, the media and the traditional media works in lockstep with the government. They were the ones, again, the New York Times was the ones pushing this propaganda that TikTok was sort of uniquely anti-Semitic, again, because there's criticism of Israel, publishing these just hyperbolic, absurd stories that completely misrepresent the actual discourse that was quite nuanced on the platform, and misrepresenting the platform and its role in relation to, Meta or YouTube or any of these other apps, which again, we see that the government can exert direct control over. I think that's what it comes down to too, is that they felt like, hey, these other American social media apps, we can control them. We can harvest data. We can ask for, the police to have a backdoor into these apps where we can surveil protesters. We can censor people's speech, et cetera, et cetera. But they feel like, we can't 100% control TikTok. Maybe we don't know. And so let's just shut it down. It's so deeply concerning. And it's worrying to me when I see these other sort of pundits and people with these huge audiences feeding these narratives, because it's so hard to counter. People just drink up all this misinformation, and you see people saying, "Oh, but China." It's like China was so secondary in all of this, right? Like you can see the motivations were not China, because if the motivations were cracking down on China getting our data, I mean, China can get far more data in a million other ways. And by the way, Temu and Shein, those are actually Chinese companies based in China, and they harvest far more sensitive user data than TikTok ever could. And there's absolutely no effort to crack down on them.
Yeah, you have to wonder when these guys, I mean, Warner is what, like 70? I mean, he's an old guy. They're getting these briefings. Do they even understand what they're being told? Like, are they, as I reported this, I thought, okay, they're manipulating the intelligence. And then as I looked at it closer, I came to this sort of tentative view that they might not understand that just because there's a lot of posts of something, that doesn't mean the algorithm is choosing that. That means people want to see that because they're interested in it. And it increasingly seems like they just don't understand what these platforms are because they don't use them.
I think fundamentally, they just don't respect the public, right? Like TikTok is gone. Young people still don't support the genocide. They still don't want us to send billions of dollars to bomb innocent children in Palestine. That's not something most Americans want our taxpayer dollars to go to. And yet they continue to do it because they don't respect what the American people want. It's all about lining their pockets. It's all about setting yourself up for a nice, rich job, with Palantir, or rewarding the defense contractors that pay the bills, or AIPAC.
That was the biggest takeaway to me from all of this, was just the naked contempt they have for the American people. You do not have a shit-eating grin like he had and, be chuckling and laughing amongst yourselves if you have the slightest shred of respect for the people that you're supposed to represent.
All right, Ken. Well, thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure.
All right, that's it for the show. Don't forget to subscribe to my tech and online culture newsletter. It's usermag.co. That's usermag.co for all the best tech, online culture news. I talk about the way the internet is affecting politics, culture, business, and more. Thanks again for listening, and see you next week.